Welcome to Sherlock Midnight Echo, where every whisper hides a chilling mystery.
No one in Little Dalloway could later agree on the exact moment when the afternoon turned from festive to fatal. Some insisted it was when the church clock struck 4 and the sound seemed sharper than usual. Others maintained it was earlier still, when Mrs. Hardwick's smile faltered for the briefest instant as she handed around the cards. Miss Marple herself, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, would have said that such moments were rarely announced at all. They slipped in quietly, disguised as ordinary things. The Christmas fete at Dalloway Hall had been planned with the sort of cheerful efficiency that suggested nothing could possibly go wrong. Evergreen garlands looped the banisters, holly gleamed against polished oak, and the air carried a comforting confusion of beeswax polish, mulled wine, and freshly baked scones. It was the kind of occasion that reassured villagers that life remained orderly, predictable, and fundamentally kind. Miss Marple sat near the window in the morning room, where the pale winter light was best for her eyes. She had been placed there by Mrs. Bantry, who believed, incorrectly, that Miss Marple preferred to be out of the way. From this vantage point, however, one could see nearly everything worth seeing. At the center of the room stood Mrs. Eleanor Hardwick, mistress of Dalloway Hall, receiving compliments with gracious composure. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with silver-threaded hair and a voice that conveyed authority even when she spoke of trifles. The fete, she reminded everyone, was in aid of the church roof, though Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Hardwick never quite met the vicar's eyes when she said it. Nearby, Colonel James Hardwick, her husband, hovered with a glass of sherry he did not drink. His military bearing remained intact, but there was something restless in the way his fingers drummed against the stem of the glass. He watched the guests as though they were troops under inspection, though whether he expected insubordination or disaster was not immediately clear. "Such a crowd," murmured Miss Marple to herself, counting heads with mild interest, just like the harvest supper in St. Mary Mead, the year poor Mr. Ellis took ill. So many smiles, and every one of them meaning something different. The highlight of the afternoon, the thing everyone had come to see, was Mrs. Hardwick's festive game. It was meant to be a harmless diversion, a parlor game involving sealed envelopes, each containing a harmless secret or playful confession, submitted anonymously by the guests beforehand. The idea, Mrs. Hardwick explained brightly, was to guess who had written which confession. "It will be tremendous fun," she said, her laugh ringing just a fraction too loudly. "Nothing serious, I assure you." Miss Marple's needles paused. Nothing serious, she reflected, was often the most serious thing of all. The guests gathered eagerly. There was Dr. Lionel Fraser, the village GP, whose genial manner concealed a sharp impatience with foolishness. Beside him stood his wife, Margaret, smiling dutifully and saying very little. Young Clara Whitcomb, the schoolmistress, hovered near the fire, her eyes bright with curiosity and perhaps a touch of anxiety. Mr. Arthur Pell, the solicitor, adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, as though the room itself was slightly out of focus. And then there was Mr. Rupert Vale. He arrived late, stamping snow from his shoes, apologizing with a charming grin that did not quite reach his eyes. A newcomer to the village, he had taken the old mill cottage by the stream and promptly become an object of interest. He was handsome in a careless way, with dark hair and an easy laugh, and Miss Marple observed that several of the ladies looked up when he entered, some with interest, others with something closer to resentment. Mrs. Hardwick's expression flickered when she saw him. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her hostess's smile. But Miss Marple had seen such flickers before. They were rarely meaningless. The game began. Mrs. Hardwick selected the first envelope and read aloud, "I once told a lie that ruined someone's life." There was a ripple of laughter, quickly subdued. "Oh, how dramatic!" cried Mrs. Bantry. "Surely no one means that seriously." Miss Marple noticed that Colonel Hardwick's fingers had stopped drumming. Guesses were offered, mostly in jest. Dr. Fraser laughed it off. Clara blushed scarlet. Mr. Pell murmured something about youthful indiscretions. Mrs. Hardwick smiled throughout, though her eyes scanned the room with a peculiar intensity. Another envelope. "I know something about this village that would shock everyone here. More. Laughter, though it sounded thinner this time. Rupert Vale raised his eyebrows appreciatively, as if enjoying a private joke. By the third envelope, the room had grown warmer, the air heavier. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. Then Mrs. Hardwick opened the fourth envelope. She read the words silently first. For a moment no one spoke. Her face drained of color, leaving her expression oddly unfinished, like a portrait abandoned halfway through. "Eleanor?" said Colonel Hardwick sharply. She tried to laugh. The sound failed her. This is quite ridiculous," she said, and then swayed. The envelope slipped from her fingers. She collapsed forward, striking the edge of the table before crumpling to the carpet. There was shouting then, and movement. Chairs scraping, someone calling for Dr. Fraser, Mrs. Bantry exclaiming in a high, distressed voice. Dr. Fraser knelt beside Mrs. Hardwick at once, his professional calm snapping into place. Miss Marple did not move. She had seen fainting spells before, and she had seen death. This, she thought quietly, was the latter. Dr. Fraser looked up at last, his face grave. "I'm afraid," he said, "Mrs. Hardwick is dead." The room fell into a silence so complete that the crackle of the fire sounded indecently loud. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Games, she reflected, were dangerous things. People forgot that lies, festive or otherwise, had a way of telling the truth at the most inconvenient times. And somewhere, she felt sure, the person who had written that final confession was already rehearsing their innocence. For several seconds after Dr. Fraser spoke, no one seemed capable of understanding the words. They hovered in the air like smoke, unreal and faintly offensive. Then reality asserted itself with the clatter of human reaction. "Oh, how dreadful," whispered Mrs. Bantry, sinking into a chair as though her legs ached. Ad abruptly resigned their duties. Someone began to cry. Miss Marple thought it was Margaret Fraser, though the sound was muffled and uncertain, as if its owner were not quite convinced she ought to be making it. Colonel Hardwick stood rigid, staring down at his wife's still form with an expression that suggested, not grief, but disbelief, as though a fundamental rule of existence had been violated. Dr. Fraser rose slowly, brushing his hands together with unnecessary vigor. "She's quite gone," he said. "There was nothing to be done." "Her heart?" ventured Mr. Pell, the solicitor, in a voice that trembled despite his obvious effort to keep it steady. Dr. Fraser hesitated. "Possibly, though I should prefer not to speculate just yet." Miss Marple noticed that he avoided looking at the fallen envelope, which lay face down near Mrs. Hardwick's hand. Colonel Hardwick found his voice at last. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "Eleanor was in excellent health. She had a medical examination only last month." "People do die suddenly," Dr. Fraser replied. "Even healthy people." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "to no one in particular they do. But it is rarely without a reason." No one heard her, which was just as well. The guests were ushered, some gently, some firmly, into the adjoining drawing-room, while Dr. Fraser and Colonel Hardwick remained behind. Mrs. Bantry took charge with brisk efficiency, dispensing instructions and cups of tea in equal measure, as though hot liquid might restore order to the universe. What a terrible shock, she repeated to anyone who would listen. Absolutely terrible. And at Christmas, too. Speculation bloomed almost at once, as inevitable as frost on a cold morning. "It must have been the excitement," said Mrs. Greenaway, the baker's wife. "All that nonsense with secrets. I never approved." "Nerves," said Mr. Pell. "Some women are highly strung." "I always thought there was something odd about her," murmured another voice. "All that control. It isn't natural." Miss Marple listened attentively, her mild blue eyes moving from face to face. People revealed so much, she had often found, in moments like these, especially the things they did not intend to say. Rupert Vale stood slightly apart from the others, leaning against the mantelpiece, his expression carefully composed. He met Miss Marple's gaze and inclined his head politely. She returned the gesture with a small, vague smile, noting how his fingers worried the cuff of his sleeve. Clara Whitcomb sat rigidly on the edge of a chair, hands clasped in her lap. Her lips moved silently, as though rehearsing something she dared not yet say. Margaret Fraser hovered near her husband, watching him with anxious devotion. At last Dr. Fraser entered the room again. "I've sent for the police," he announced. "It's only proper." A murmur ran through the room, half relief, half alarm. "The police?" echoed Mrs. Bantry. "But surely it may be nothing more than a sudden collapse," he said. "But Mrs. Hardwick died in unusual circumstances. It would be irresponsible not to report it." Miss Marple approved. She had always found that the truth benefited from a certain amount of official attention, even if it rarely depended upon it. Colonel Hardwick appeared in the doorway, his face drawn and grey. "The game," he said abruptly. "That ridiculous game. What was in the envelope she was reading?" No one answered at once. Several pairs of eyes turned instinctively toward the small table in the morning room, where the remaining envelope still lay, neat and innocent. "I think," said Dr. Fraser carefully, "we should leave everything exactly as it is until the police arrive." Colonel Hardwick made an impatient gesture but said no more. Time stretched. Outside, dusk crept over the lawns of Dalloway Hall, and the first lights appeared in the village below. The warmth of the fire now felt oppressive, and the scent of mulled wine had turned cloying. Miss Marple rose at last and moved quietly toward the doorway, her manner suggesting nothing more than a desire for fresh air. No one stopped her. In moments of crisis, elderly ladies were often treated as part of the furniture. She paused just inside the morning room. Mrs. Hardwick lay where she had fallen, her face oddly peaceful now, the lines of authority smoothed away. The envelope still lay nearby. Miss Marple did not touch it. She merely looked. There were certain deaths, she reflected, that announced themselves loudly as crimes. Others whispered. This one had whispered, but whispers, she knew, could be far more revealing than shouts. Footsteps sounded behind her. Rupert Vale stood in the doorway. "Awful business," he said lightly. "Quite spoilt the fete." Miss Marple turned, her expression vague and kindly. "Yes," she agreed, "games can be so very dangerous. One never knows who might take them seriously. For a fraction of a second, his smile faltered." Miss Marple noticed. Rupert Vale recovered himself quickly, as people so often did when they realized they had betrayed more than they intended. He gave a small laugh and stepped aside to let Miss Marple pass. "I expect you're right," he said. "Words can be dangerous things." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "especially when they are written down." She returned to the drawing-room, where the atmosphere had grown tighter still. The guests spoke in low voices now, as though loud speech might provoke some further calamity. Mrs. Bantry hovered near the door, anxiously consulting her watch for the third time in as many minutes. "They really ought to be here by now," she murmured. "The police, I mean." "They will come," said Miss Marple placidly. "They always do." The sound of tires on gravel at last announced their arrival. 2 uniformed constables entered first, followed by a tall, spare man in a dark overcoat whose manner suggested both competence and a certain weary patience. He introduced himself as Inspector Dennis Mallory. Mallory listened carefully as Dr. Fraser summarized the events of the afternoon. He asked precise questions, interrupting only when clarification was required. Miss Marple observed him with interest. He had the look of a man who preferred facts to theories, and who would accept the latter only when the former refused to cooperate. "I should like to see the body," Mallory said at last. Colonel Hardwick stiffened but nodded. "This way." The inspector emerged from the morning room several minutes later, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Fraser," he said, "you mentioned the possibility of a sudden cardiac event. Did Mrs. Hardwick suffer from any known heart condition?" "None whatsoever," Fraser replied. "As I said, she was examined recently." Mallory inclined his head. "We'll know more after the post-mortem. In the meantime, I'd like to speak with everyone who was present." A collective sigh followed. Chairs were rearranged, and the guests were questioned one by one. Where were they standing? What had they seen? Had Mrs. Hardwick appeared unwell earlier in the day? The answers were, for the most part, unhelpful. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Mrs. Hardwick had been her usual self, efficient, commanding, perhaps a trifle strained, but then she always was when entertaining. "And the game?" Mallory asked eventually. "Whose idea was it?" Mrs. Bantry answered eagerly. "Eleanor's, of course. She thought it would be fun. Did anyone object?" There was a brief pause. "I thought it was in rather poor taste," said Mrs. Greenaway primly. "Prying into people's secrets. But you took part, Malla." "I observed. Well, yes. One didn't want to seem unfriendly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. How often that desire led to disaster. Mallory turned to the table where the envelopes lay. "How many were there?" "10, said Mr. Pell. "One from each guest, I believe. And how many were read aloud?" "4, said Clara Whitcomb, her voice barely above a whisper. Mallory picked up the remaining envelopes, examining them without opening any. "And the one Mrs. Hardwick was reading when she collapsed?" Dr. Fraser hesitated. "She didn't read it aloud." "I see." Mallory's gaze moved slowly around the room. "I should like to know who wrote that particular confession." A ripple of unease followed. Several people shifted in their seats. Rupert Vale crossed one leg over the other with deliberate care. "I'm afraid that was the point of the game," he said lightly. "Anonymity." Mallory regarded him coolly. "Games have a way of losing their charm when someone dies." He turned back to Dr. Fraser. "Did you notice anything unusual about the body? Any sign of poison?" Fraser frowned. "No obvious signs. But again, I should prefer not to speculate." Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly near the window, spoke up. "It is curious," she said, "how often poison is imagined to announce itself. In my experience, it is usually quite discreet." Mallory looked at her for the first time with real attention. "And you are Miss Marple," she said, "a friend of Mrs. Bantry's. Have you medical training, Miss Marple?" "Oh, no," she said cheerfully. "Only an interest in people." Mallory nodded, though his expression suggested he was not yet convinced of the usefulness of such an interest. The questioning continued. When it was Rupert Vale's turn, he answered smoothly, with an air of amused detachment. "I arrived late, as you know," he said. "I hadn't the pleasure of contributing a confession. I was merely an observer." Mallory raised an eyebrow. "You didn't write an envelope?" "No time, I'm afraid." Miss Marple noted how carefully he avoided saying that he hadn't read any of the others. Clara Whitcomb's turn was less composed. Her hands shook as she spoke, and more than once she stumbled over her words. "I didn't mean any harm," she said suddenly, as though to herself. "It was only meant to be silly." "What was?" Mallory asked. She flushed deeply. "The confession I wrote. It wasn't serious." Mallory made a note. "Thank you, Miss Whitcomb." At last the inspector closed his notebook. "For the moment," he said, "this appears to be a sudden death under unusual circumstances. Until we know more, I must ask that none of you discuss the details outside this room." There was a murmur of assent, though Miss Marple suspected it would not last beyond the front gate. As the guests began to disperse, she remained seated, her gaze fixed on the table of envelopes. There was something about them, so neat, so orderly, that troubled her. People were rarely either. She rose and moved closer, peering at the handwriting on the envelopes. Most were written in a careful, deliberate hand. One, however, stood out, its writing slanted, hurried, as though the writer had been anxious to be done. Miss Marple felt a small, familiar tightening of interest. It was often the smallest irregularities, she knew, that pointed the way to the truth. Miss Marple did not linger over the envelopes long enough to attract attention. She had learned, over the years, that curiosity was best exercised in small, unobtrusive doses. A glance too long could invite questions. A glance too short might miss what mattered. Satisfied for the moment, she returned to her chair by the window as Inspector Mallory conferred quietly with Dr. Fraser and Colonel Hardwick. Outside, the first flakes of snow had begun to fall again, rifting lazily past the darkened panes. The sight reminded Miss Marple of another winter afternoon long ago, when a young woman in St. Mary Mead had sworn she was perfectly happy, just hours before running away with a married man. People, Miss Marple reflected, often mistook composure for contentment. The guests were allowed to leave in small groups. There was a subdued politeness about their departures, an exaggerated courtesy that suggested everyone was keenly aware of being observed. Mrs. Greenaway clutched her handbag as though it might be confiscated. Mr. Pell departed with the air of a man already composing a statement in his head. Clara Whitcomb lingered uncertainly, then slipped away without meeting anyone's eye. Rupert Vale paused near the door, speaking briefly to Inspector Mallory. Miss Marple could not hear the words, but she saw the easy smile, the relaxed posture, the faint shrug of the shoulders. It was all very practiced. Mallory listened, nodded once, and let him go. "Charming fellow," Mrs. Bantry murmured, watching him leave. "Though I can't help thinking he's rather too pleased with himself." Miss Marple smiled. "Charm can be very useful. It encourages people not to ask questions." Before Mrs. Bantry could reply, Inspector Mallory approached them. "I hope you won't mind, Miss Marple," he said, "but I should like to ask you a few questions." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "I'm afraid I can't tell you much." "I find," Mallory replied, "that people who say that often tell me a great deal." He gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. "You were present throughout the game?" "Yes." "And you noticed nothing unusual about Mrs. Hardwick before she collapsed?" Miss Marple considered. "She seemed preoccupied." "In what way?" "Oh, just little things. She kept glancing at the envelopes, as though she were anxious about what might come next. Rather like a child waiting for a scolding." Mallory's pen paused. "Did she seem frightened?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, more determined than frightened. She struck me as a woman who believed she was in control, until she wasn't. And the envelope she was reading. She didn't read it aloud," Miss Marple said, "but whatever was written there affected her very strongly." Mallory studied her for a moment. "You're very observant." Miss Marple gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Living in a village rather encourages it. There's so little else to do." Mallory did not smile, but there was a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. "One more thing," he said. "Did you notice anyone behaving oddly at the moment of Mrs. Hardwick's collapse?" Miss Marple hesitated just long enough to seem uncertain. "Mr. Vale," she said at last. He was watching her very closely, not with concern, more with interest. Mallory nodded slowly. "Thank you, Miss Marple." When he moved away, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. She disliked singling people out, but truth, she knew, was not always kind. The house grew quieter as the last of the guests departed. Mrs. Bantry insisted that Miss Marple stay the night rather than attempt the journey home in the snow, and arrangements were made with a flurry of whispered instructions. Colonel Hardwick retired to his study, declining all offers of company. Dr. Fraser remained behind, speaking in low tones with Mallory about medical details Miss Marple could not hear. Later, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she found her thoughts returning to the game, to the idea of secrets offered up so lightly, as though they were party favors rather than weapons. She paused by the window, looking out at the darkened grounds. Somewhere in the village, she was certain, someone was replaying the afternoon again and again, testing each moment for flaws. The truth had been written D.O.N. that day. Miss Marple felt sure of it. The difficulty lay in discovering who had written it, and why Mrs. Hardwick had found it so deadly. Downstairs, a door closed softly. Miss Marple turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. The game, she suspected, was far from over. Miss Marple slept lightly and woke early, as she always did in unfamiliar surroundings. The house lay very still, the silence broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere along the corridor. For a moment she lay listening, her mind already busy, arranging impressions as one might sort buttons by size and color. Downstairs, the household had resumed a semblance of routine, though the strain showed in every movement. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Mrs. Bantry spoke in hushed tones, as if the walls themselves might be listening, and the servants moved with exaggerated care, avoiding one another's eyes. Colonel Hardwick did not appear. "He's had a dreadful shock," Mrs. Bantry explained apologetically. Inspector Mallory advised him to rest. Miss Marple nodded. Shocks, she knew, affected people in remarkably selective ways. Inspector Mallory arrived shortly after breakfast, stamping snow from his boots and accepting a cup of tea he did not drink. He asked to see the envelopes again. Mrs. Bantry produced them at once, laying them out on the dining table like exhibits in a museum. Mallory examined them carefully. "These were written before the fete?" "Yes," said Mrs. Bantry. "Everyone was asked to submit one in advance. Everyone except Mr. Vale," Mallory murmured. Miss Marple watched as he compared the handwriting, his brow furrowed. She doubted he would find what he wanted there. People often took great pains to disguise their writing when they believed anonymity was assured. "What about the contents?" Mallory asked. Mrs. Bantry looked distressed. "I'm not sure it's proper. It's nay." "Cesare," he said quietly. With visible reluctance, she opened the envelopes one by one. The confessions were, as promised, mostly trivial: a youthful flirtation, a petty theft long regretted, a harmless deception practiced on a spouse. Mallory listened, impassive, making notes. "And the fourth?" he asked at last. Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then opened it. Her face changed. "Oh," she said faintly. "Oh, my dear." Mallory leaned forward. "What does it say?" She swallowed. "It says, 'I know who you really are, and what you did before you came to Little Dalloway.'" There was a pause. "To whom was it addressed?" Mallory asked. "It doesn't say," Mrs. Bantry replied, "but Eleanor must have believed it was meant for her." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of recognition. That, she thought, would do it. People could endure many things, but exposure, especially public exposure, was another matter entirely. Mallory closed his notebook. "That suggests motive," he said, "but not method." "Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "the shock itself was the method." Mallory looked at her sharply. "You believe the confession killed her?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that it frightened her very badly. And fear can be quite as lethal as poison, particularly if it arrives suddenly." Mallory considered this. "The post-mortem will tell us more." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but it will not tell us who wrote that note, or why." The inspector turned back to the envelopes. Several people here could have had reason to threaten Mrs. Hardwick. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "but only one would know precisely which words would hurt her most." Mallory studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like to speak to the others again. Individually." They began with Clara Whitcomb, who arrived looking pale and exhausted. She admitted readily that she had written one of the confessions, about a harmless lie told to a foe, her employer, but denied any knowledge of the fatal note. "I admired Mrs. Hardwick," she said earnestly. "She helped me settle in the village." Miss Marple believed her. Admiration, she had found, rarely coexisted comfortably with malice. Mrs. Greenaway was next, indignant at the very suggestion. "I would never write such a thing," she declared. "Threatening people, it's vulgar." Mr. Pell protested his innocence with legal precision, pointing out that he would hardly jeopardize his own reputation by provoking a scandal. "And Colonel Hardwick?" Mallory asked. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "He's very private." Mallory nodded. "So I've gathered. When Rupert Vale was summoned, he arrived with his usual air of unconcern, though Miss Marple noticed a faint tension around his mouth. 'A nasty little message,' he said when it was read aloud. 'Rather spoils the fun. Did you write it?' Mallory asked bluntly. Vale smiled. 'I told you I didn't submit an envelope. But you arrived late,' Mallory said. 'You could have slipped one in unnoticed.' Vale shrugged. 'If I had wanted to frighten Mrs. Hardwick, I'd have chosen my moment more carefully.' Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. Moments, she knew, were often chosen with great care indeed. After he left, Mallory paced the room. Someone knew enough about Mrs. Hardwick's past to terrify her. Someone who wanted her silenced or exposed. Miss Marple folded her hands. Or someone who believed she might act. Mallory stopped. "Act, yes," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Hardwick was a woman who took control of situations. If she thought her secret was about to be revealed, she might have tried to stop it. Mallory frowned. "By confronting the writer?" "Possibly," said Miss Marple. "Or by playing along until she could turn the tables." Mallory looked thoughtful. "You think she recognized the handwriting?" "I think," Miss Marple said, She recognized the truth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the edges of the village. Inside Dalloway Hall, the game's pieces were slowly being turned over, one by one. Miss Marple felt certain of one thing: whoever had written that confession had not intended to kill Mrs. Hardwick, at least not that way. And that, she suspected, was precisely what made them dangerous. Inspector Mallory remained at Dalloway Hall through the afternoon, his presence lending the house a subdued sense of official gravity. Miss Marple, knitting once more, occupied a chair near the fire and appeared absorbed in her work. In reality, she was listening very carefully. Colonel Hardwick emerged from his study at last, looking older than he had the day before. His movements were stiff, his expression guarded. Mallory rose at once. "Colonel," he said, "I'm sorry to trouble you again, but there are a few matters we must clarify." Hardwick inclined his head. "Of course." They spoke quietly at first, but certain words carried. "You were unaware of any threats made against your wife?" Mallory asked. "None," Hardwick replied curtly. "Eleanor had enemies, if that's what you mean. Anyone in her position does. But nothing of this sort. Did she ever speak of her past? Before little Dalloway?" A pause followed. Miss Marple counted 3 stitches. "My wife's past was her own concern," Hardwick said at last. "She had no obligation to explain herself to anyone." Mallory studied him. "Not even to you." Hardwick's jaw tightened. "Especially not to me." Miss Marple glanced up briefly. Marriage, she reflected, was a curious arrangement, particularly when secrets were involved. Later, when Mallory stepped outside to take a call, Miss Marple found herself alone in the room with Colonel Hardwick. She set her knitting aside. "Such a terrible shock," she said kindly. "Losing one's wife so suddenly." He nodded stiffly. "Yes. She was a very capable woman," Miss Marple continued. "Very much in control." He gave a short laugh. "That she was—" "Control," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "can be comforting, but it can also be exhausting." Hardwick looked at her sharply, then away. "You didn't know my wife?" "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but I have known women rather like her." He said nothing more, and Miss Marple did not press him. There were truths, she knew, that required time rather than questions. By late afternoon, Mallory received word from the pathologist. The preliminary findings were inconclusive, but suggested that Mrs. Hardwick had suffered a severe cardiac event, likely triggered by extreme emotional distress. "So no poison," Mallory said grimly. "No," replied Dr. Fraser. "Nothing of that nature." Mallory exhaled slowly. "Which brings us back to motive." Miss Marple nodded. "And opportunity." Mallory frowned. "Opportunity to frighten her, yes. But not to kill her, unless the fright was intentional." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Sometimes," she said, "people play games without considering the consequences. They believe themselves quite safe because they have not planned anything dreadful." Mallory glanced at her. "You think this was meant as a warning?" "Or a test," Miss Marple replied. "To see how Mrs. Hardwick would react." Mallory's eyes narrowed. "And someone miscalculated?" "Yes." That evening, the village began to buzz. Despite Mallory's instructions, speculation spread with remarkable speed. Miss Marple heard snippets everywhere, at the post office, outside the butcher's shop, murmured over garden fences. "She wasn't what she claimed to be. Ran away from something, I heard. Someone recognized her." Miss Marple listened, filing each rumor away. Gossip, she knew, was rarely accurate, but it was often revealing. The following morning brought a new development. Inspector Mallory arrived at Mrs. Bantry's cottage early, his expression grave. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you should know. We've had another incident." Her knitting paused. "Oh dear, one of the remaining envelopes has gone missing." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Missing? But they were locked away." "They were," Mallory agreed, "which suggests someone was very keen to retrieve it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Which one?" Mallory hesitated. "The one with the slanted handwriting. Miss Marple felt a quiet sense of inevitability settle over her. Of course, the irregularities always mattered in the end. Then, she said gently, someone has decided the game is no longer amusing. Mallory nodded, and that someone was close enough to know which envelope to take. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts moving swiftly now. A threat, a shock, a death, and now concealment. The pattern was becoming clearer. Whoever had written that confession had not expected Mrs. Hardwick to die. But once she had, they had realized something else, that the truth, if discovered, might prove fatal to them as well. And people, Miss Marple knew, would do extraordinary things to keep their secrets buried. Inspector Mallory's announcement cast a long shadow over the quiet comfort of Mrs. Bantry's sitting room. The fire burned cheerfully, but its warmth seemed inadequate now, as though the air itself had grown wary. "Are you quite certain?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "Perhaps it was simply mislaid." Mallory shook his head. The envelopes were sealed in a desk drawer. Only a few people had access to that room. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Which means," she said, "that whoever took it felt both urgency and confidence." "Confidence," Mallory repeated. "Yes. They knew exactly which one they wanted." Mallory frowned. "That suggests the writer recognized their own handwriting. Or Miss Marple," La added, "recognized the danger." Mallory leaned forward. "You believe the missing envelope contained the fatal confession?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that it contained something more specific than the others. Something that could not be explained away as a joke." Mallory rose. "Then we must assume this has become a criminal matter in earnest." They returned to Dalloway Hall at once. The house felt altered now, less a place of hospitality than a stage set after the actors had fled. Mallory ordered a thorough search, though Miss Marple suspected it would be fruitless. People who stole evidence rarely left it where it could be found. As the constables moved about, Mallory questioned the household staff. The maid admitted that Rupert Vale had been seen near the study earlier that morning, though she could not say whether he had gone inside. "He said he was looking for Colonel Hardwick," she added. Mallory made a note. Miss Marple, meanwhile, found an excuse to walk through the morning room once more. The table had been cleared, the chairs pushed back into place, but she could still picture the scene, the circle of expectant faces, the envelopes waiting their turn. She paused by the window, recalling the slanted handwriting. It had looked hurried, almost angry. Not the hand of someone accustomed to secrets, she thought, but of someone newly burdened by one. Footsteps sounded behind her. Clara Whitcomb stood in the doorway, twisting her gloves. "Miss Marple," she said nervously, "may I speak with you?" "Of course, my dear." Clara hesitated, then blurted out, "I didn't take the envelope. I wouldn't do such a thing." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "I didn't think you had—" Clara sagged with relief. "I was afraid, after what I told the inspector, that he might suspect me." "You told him the truth," Miss Marple said. "That is usually the safest course." Clara nodded, then lowered her voice. "But I did notice something. On the day of the fete, before the game, I saw Mrs. Hardwick arguing with someone in the garden." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Who?" "I couldn't hear much," Clara said. "But it was a man, tall, dark hair." Miss Marple thought at once of Rupert Vale. "He seemed angry," Clara continued, "and Mrs. Hardwick looked afraid." "Are you sure?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes. I remember thinking it was odd. She was never afraid of anyone." Miss Marple thanked her and watched as the girl hurried away, as though unburdening herself had cost her dearly. Later, Mallory confirmed that Rupert Vale had left the village that afternoon, claiming urgent business in London. "Convenient," Mallory said grimly. "I've put out a request to have him located." Miss Marple nodded. Flight, she reflected, was often mistaken for guilt, but it was never entirely innocent. That evening, as snow fell once more, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry, discussing village matters in a deliberately casual way. Names were mentioned, histories recalled, small scandals revived. "There was talk," Mrs. Bantry said hesitantly, "that Mrs. Hardwick wasn't always Mrs. Hardwick, that she came to Little Dalloway under a different name." Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "People do reinvent themselves," she said. sometimes quite successfully. And sometimes, Mrs. Bantry added, someone recognizes them. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And recognition can be very dangerous indeed. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt the pieces shifting into place, a hidden past, a threatening confession. A man newly arrived, carrying knowledge that could destroy a carefully constructed life. But there was still something missing. Threats alone rarely killed, and people who played dangerous games usually believed they held the winning hand. Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Hardwick. Kay had believed that too, right up until the moment she collapsed, which meant, she thought quietly, that the true deception lay not in the confession but in what followed it. Miss Marple woke the next morning with the uncomfortable certainty that something had been overlooked. Not a fact precisely, but a feeling. It was the same sensation she had experienced years before, when a perfectly respectable curate had been revealed as a thief because he polished his shoes too carefully. The mind, she knew, often protested before it explained itself. Inspector Mallory arrived shortly after breakfast, looking tired but alert. "We've located Mr. Vale," he said. "He's in London, just as he claimed. He hasn't tried to disappear." "That is interesting," Miss Marple said mildly. "You don't think he's our man?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that running away is usually an admission of panic. Staying put can be far more dangerous." Mallory regarded her thoughtfully. "We're bringing him back for further questioning." "Of course." As they spoke, Colonel Hardwick entered the room. He looked composed now, almost too much so, as though he had decided upon a role and meant to play it to the end. "I understand," he said stiffly, "that my wife's past is being discussed rather freely." Mallory met his gaze. "Only insofar as it may relate to her death." Hardwick hesitated, then sighed. "Very well. There are things I did not know until recently." Miss Marple's needle stilled. "Eleanor was not born Hardwick," he continued. "She came to me as a widow. At least that is what she claimed. I discovered only last year that her first husband had not died at all. He had been convicted of fraud and imprisoned. She changed her name and left him behind." Mallory's eyes sharpened. "And you said nothing?" "She begged me not to," Hardwick said. "She had built a life here. I saw no reason to destroy it." Miss Marple nodded. "Love," she reflected, "often expressed itself in silence." "Do you know the man's name?" Mallory asked. "Yes," Hardwick replied. "Rupert Vale." Mallory inhaled sharply. "Then he had every reason to threaten her." "Yes," said Hardwick, "but not to kill her. He wanted money. He wanted recognition. He wanted revenge." "And she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "What did she want?" Hardwick's mouth tightened. "She wanted the past to stay buried." Mallory closed his notebook. "Thank you, Colonel." That afternoon, Rupert Vale was brought back to Little Dalloway. He no longer smiled easily. The charm had thinned, revealing something harder beneath. "So," he said bitterly, "she died before she could answer me." "You wrote the confession," Mallory said. "Yes," Vale snapped. "I wanted her to know I was here. I wanted her afraid." "You didn't intend to kill her?" He laughed harshly. "Kill her? No. I wanted her to pay." Miss Marple watched him closely. His anger was genuine, but anger, she knew, could be theatrical. "Did you take the envelope?" Mallory asked. Vale hesitated. "Yes, I panicked. I didn't want it traced back to me." Mallory nodded. "Then we are left with a death caused by shock." "Not entirely," Miss Marple said softly. Both men turned to her. "Mrs. Hardwick was frightened," Miss Marple continued, "but she was also a woman who acted. She would not have collapsed simply because she recognized your handwriting, Mr. Vale. She believed something else, something immediate and final." Vale stared at her. "What are you saying?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "That the confession she read was not yours." Mallory stiffened. "But the missing envelope was taken because it was dangerous," Miss Marple said. "Not because it was threatening, but because it was precise." She turned to Colonel Hardwick. "Your wife knew her past could be exposed. But she also knew who could truly destroy her." Hardwick's face drained of color. "You," Miss Marple said gently, "had discovered her secret. And you had the most to lose if it became public." Mallory's voice was quiet. "Colonel?" Hardwick sank into a chair. "I only meant to frighten her. he said hoarsely. "To make her confess, to give me control for once." Miss Marple nodded. "And you chose words that would strike at her heart. Words only you could write." Mallory exhaled slowly. "You wrote the fatal confession, and when she died you removed the evidence." Hardwick covered his face. "I never meant—" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "You meant to win the game." Silence settled over the room. Later, as Mallory led Colonel Hardwick away, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. Mrs. Bantry watched her with awe. "How did you know?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because the most dangerous lies," she said, "are the ones told by people who believe they are entitled to the truth." Outside, the village of Little Dalloway resumed its quiet rhythms. But beneath the calm, Miss Marple knew, the echoes of the festive game would linger, an enduring reminder that some secrets once spoken could never be safely taken back. Colonel Hardwick's departure was conducted with quiet efficiency. There was no dramatic resistance, no raised voice, only the soft closing of the front door and the crunch of boots on snow as Inspector Mallory escorted him to the waiting car. The village, so accustomed to the colonel's upright figure and measured stride, seemed to hold its breath as he passed. Miss Marple watched from the window, her expression serene. She felt no triumph, only the familiar, faint sadness that accompanied such moments. People so often mistook control for righteousness, she reflected, and entitlement for love. Inside, the house felt oddly hollow. Mrs. Bantry busied herself unnecessarily, straightening cushions that did not need straightening and offering tea to no one in particular. "It's all so dreadful," she said at last. "Poor Eleanor. Poor James. And that man, Rupert Vale, after all that, he wasn't even the killer." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but he was the catalyst, and catalysts are rarely blameless." Inspector Mallory returned shortly afterward, removing his hat and rubbing his forehead. "The Crown will have its work cut out," he said. "No poison, no physical violence, just words." "Words," Miss Marple said gently, "have caused more deaths than any weapon I can think of." Mallory studied her. "You were certain, weren't you? Before the colonel confessed?" "I was reasonably sure," Miss Marple replied. "There were several small things." "Such as?" She did not read the confession aloud, Miss Marple said, which suggested she recognized it immediately. And Colonel Hardwick's reaction, his disbelief was not that of a grieving husband, but of a man whose carefully arranged world had collapsed. Mallory nodded slowly. "And the handwriting? Yes. Rupert Vale's was careless, impulsive. The missing envelope was written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and exactly how Mrs. Hardwick would react." Mallory sighed. "I don't suppose you'd consider working for the Yard?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh no, I find villages quite sufficient." The inquest was held a week later. The verdict, death by misadventure brought on by extreme emotional shock, satisfied the legal requirements, if not the moral ones. Colonel Hardwick was charged with manslaughter, his actions judged reckless rather than malicious. The village followed every detail avidly, dissecting each phrase of testimony as though it were another envelope to be opened. Rupert Vale left Little Dalloway soon after, his claims settled and his curiosity apparently exhausted. Clara Whitcomb returned to her schoolroom with a quieter manner and a new caution in her eyes. Mrs. Greenaway continued to speak of the affair at every opportunity, though with increasing embellishment. Life, as it always did, resumed its patterns. On Miss Marple's last afternoon before returning home, she and Mrs. Bantry walked together along the edge of the green. Snowdrops were beginning to push through the cold earth, brave and incongruous. "I can't help thinking," Mrs. Bantry said, "that if Eleanor Hardwick had simply told the truth from the beginning, things might have been very different." Miss Marple agreed. "But then, she would not have been the woman she was." They paused, watching a pair of children slide across a frozen puddle, shrieking with laughter. "Do you think," Mrs. Bantry asked hesitantly, "that the game was wicked in itself?" Miss Marple considered. "No. Games are innocent enough. It is what people bring to them, their fears, their resentments, their need for power that makes them dangerous." She turned back toward the house, her steps unhurried. In villages, she added, people believe they know one another very well. But knowledge is a tricky thing. It can comfort or it can kill. That evening, as Miss Marple packed her bag, she placed her knitting carefully on top, the familiar weight reassuring. Another village, another tragedy, another reminder that human nature changed very little, no matter how pleasant the setting. As the lights of Little Dalloway faded behind her carriage the next morning, Miss Marple allowed herself one final thought. Secrets, she knew, were never truly buried. They waited patiently for a game, a word, or a moment of fatal honesty to rise again. The carriage rolled smoothly over the snow-swept lanes, carrying Miss Marple back toward the familiar contours of St. Mary Mead. Outside, the village lay quiet and pale in the winter sun, a world seemingly untouched by the disturbances of Little Dalloway. Yet Miss Marple knew better. The village had its own secrets, its own whispers, and its own small tragedies waiting quietly in the corners of hearth and garden. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her knitting resting beside her, and allowed her mind to wander over the events of the past fortnight. Each face, each conversation, each subtle shift of expression came back to her in careful order. Clara Whitcomb's fear, Rupert Vale's fleeting tension, Colonel Hardwicke's over-controlled outrage, they were all pieces in a puzzle that had, in the end, revealed a painful yet inevitable truth. The game, she thought, had been innocuous in its design, merely a festive curiosity. Yet human nature, as she had often observed, had a way of transforming innocence into peril. Mrs. Hardwicke's life had been constructed with meticulous care, each detail of her past carefully hidden. And when that delicate balance had been threatened, even in jest, the consequences had been swift and irreversible. Miss Marple considered the final act with a quiet satisfaction. It had not been through force or cunning alone that the mystery had been resolved. Through careful attention, patient observation, and an understanding of the subtle workings of fear, pride, and guilt. People often revealed themselves in the smallest of gestures, the lightest hesitation, the unguarded glance. Recognizing these signs had allowed her to see what others could not, that the true danger had not come from the obvious outsider, but from within the household itself. As the carriage approached the familiar gates of her own village, she allowed herself a small smile. The world was not safer for having uncovered the truth, nor were its hearts any less complicated, but there was a certain comfort in understanding. She knew that, at least for the moment, the game was over, and the web of deceit had been untangled. Back in St. Mary Mead, the quiet of her own sitting room welcomed her. She settled into her favorite chair, the knitting in her hands, and let the events of Little Dalloway play through her mind one last time. The lessons were as clear as ever. Secrets have power, words have weight, and the human heart, capable of both generosity and malice, remained as unpredictable as ever. And yet, for all the darkness and danger she had witnessed, Miss Marple felt the familiar, steady warmth of hope. People could be forgiven, mistakes could be learned from, and in time, life would move forward. The village, with all its small dramas and quiet intrigues, would endure. And she, as always, would be there to notice what others overlooked, listening to the whispers that might one day reveal the next story waiting just beyond the snow-laden trees. As the fire crackled softly, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the rhythm comforting and steady, and allowed herself a final reflection. Even the deadliest games could be understood, if one only knew how to watch, how to wait, and how to read the hearts of those around them. In the quiet of her room, with the village settled outside, the mystery was complete, and the festive game of fatal lies had finally run its course. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a tranquil hush, broken only by the distant bark of a dog and the soft creak of shutters in the chill wind. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting paused in her lap as she reflected on the subtle threads of human behavior that had brought clarity to Little Dalloway's tragedy. Even now, weeks later, the puzzle played itself over in her mind, the careful steps of observation, the small details that no one else noticed, the tiny tells that revealed more than words ever could. A gentle knock at the door drew her attention. It was a letter, delivered by the postman, slightly damp from the lingering winter snow. She opened it carefully, her keen eyes scanning the neat script. It was from Mrs. Bantry, a brief note of thanks for her assistance, and an invitation to visit once more when the roads cleared. Miss Marple smiled faintly, folding the letter and tucking it beside her knitting. Friendships, she reflected, were often strengthened by shared calamity, and sometimes comfort was the most necessary consequence of a mystery resolved. She rose, moving to the window, watching the last pale light fade from the village green. The villagers went about their simple tasks, oblivious to the complexity that lay beneath each polite nod, each exchange of pleasantries. Miss Marple's mind drifted to Rupert Vale, now safely returned to London, perhaps chastened, perhaps bitter. And Colonel Hardwicke, facing the consequences of his actions, a man forced to confront the truth that had always been within reach, yet remained concealed until it was too late. The lesson, she thought, was as perennial as the snowdrops that would soon appear in the gardens. People could be guided by love, by fear, by pride, and by desperation, and these forces, subtle though they might be, were often more powerful than any weapon. She glanced at her knitting again, the familiar rhythm calming her. Just as in her quiet village, the solution had depended not on forensics or brute force, but on careful attention, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. A firefly of thought flickered through her mind, musing on the resilience of people and the quiet courage it took to face one's secrets. The festive game, fatal though it had been, had revealed not just malice and fear, but the capacity for accountability and the fragile beauty of human honesty. She allowed herself a quiet smile, appreciating the irony that games meant for amusement could so quickly become lessons in life and death. Miss Marple returned to her chair, finally resuming her knitting, letting the soft click of needles punctuate the stillness. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead held its peaceful rhythm, untroubled by the intricacies of other lives, yet forever connected to them by invisible threads of observation, judgment, and understanding. And within that quiet, Miss Marple allowed herself a thought both comforting and precise. The world was far from perfect, but the truths she had uncovered, small though they might be, had restored a measure of balance, and that, in itself, was a kind of justice. The night deepened, the fire crackled, and Miss Marple, with her mind alert yet serene, understood as always that while some mysteries ended, others waited patiently just beyond the horizon. And she would be ready, as she always was, to notice, to listen, and to discern the human heart behind every quiet shadow. The following morning brought a crisp clarity to St. Mary Mead, the snow sparkling in the pale sunlight as if the village itself had been washed clean by the events of the past weeks. Miss Marple stepped out briefly, enjoying the sharp air, letting it fill her lungs while her eyes roamed over the familiar roofs and hedgerows. Life had resumed its ordinary rhythms, yet beneath the quiet, she knew that the echoes of Little Dalloway lingered, like a faint shadow, a reminder of human frailty and the consequences of hidden truths. She made her way back indoors and settled in her favorite armchair, the fire sending warm light across the room. The knitting needles clicked softly, marking the steady passage of time, and Miss Marple reflected on what had transpired. The festive game had begun in the spirit of light-hearted curiosity, but it had uncovered vulnerabilities, past transgressions, and the lethal power of fear and secrecy. It had also reaffirmed her conviction that observation, patience, and an understanding of human character were the finest instruments for uncovering the truth. A knock at the door brought her from her reverie. It was a visiting neighbor, coming to inquire after her well-being and to offer the latest village news. Conversation flowed easily, touching on the mundane and the cheerful, new puppies, the progress of the winter crops, the plans for the spring fete. Yet Miss Marple's mind, while outwardly engaged, traced patterns invisible to others. She thought of Clara Whitcomb, now settled in her classroom with a steadier confidence, and of Mrs. Bantry, who had weathered her own anxieties with remarkable fortitude. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, despite the tragedy, life had endured, and the village remained a place of awe. idea of community and of the subtle interplay of secrets and confidences. Miss Marple mused on the fragile equilibrium of human relations, the balance between trust and suspicion, concealment and revelation, and how easily it could be disrupted by the most innocent of provocations. The day waned, and as twilight fell, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of contemplation. She realized that mysteries such as the one at Dalloway Hall were never simply about right and wrong, guilt or innocence. They were about understanding, about noticing the invisible currents of fear, pride, and desire that propelled people toward actions they might later regret. In recognizing those currents, one gained insight not only into the immediate mystery, but into the enduring patterns of human behavior. As the last light faded and the village settled into evening stillness, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the soft rhythm a comfort against the complexities of the world. Beyond the windows, the quiet village lay wrapped in snow and shadow, serene yet ever poised for the next twist of human nature that might disturb its calm. And in that quiet, she knew she would always be ready, watchful, patient, and unassuming, to notice the smallest tell, the slightest hesitation, the subtle clue that would one day reveal the hidden truths waiting just beneath the surface. With that thought, Miss Marple leaned back, the gentle crackle of the fire accompanying her quiet satisfaction. Another mystery had reached its conclusion. But life, with all its small deceptions and heartfelt revelations, continued onward, as intricate, delicate, and quietly fascinating as ever. The following week passed with the steady rhythm of village life, each day adding small touches of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the drama of Little Dalloway. Miss Marple moved through her familiar outings, visiting neighbors, tending to her garden, and keeping an eye on the subtle changes in the behavior of those around her. She had learned long ago that even after a mystery was resolved, its ripples continued to spread, quietly reshaping relationships and perceptions. One morning, as she walked along the lane toward the post office, she noticed Clara Whitcomb pausing to adjust her scarf, glancing back over her shoulder with a mixture of caution and relief. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. The girl had been through much in the past weeks, yet she had emerged steadier, more attentive to the nuances of the world around her. She reminded Miss Marple of the lesson Little Dalloway had offered. Fear, when understood and faced, could be transformed into wisdom. Returning home, Miss Marple found a parcel on her doorstep, a small gift from Mrs. Bantry, a token of gratitude and a reminder of the bonds forged through shared experience. She opened it carefully, revealing a delicate hand-knit scarf in soft winter hues. Holding it, she reflected on the extraordinary ordinary lives around her, the lives that, while outwardly serene, contained layers of history, emotion, and secret motives. Even when tragedy struck, the threads of kindness, courage, and insight remained, ready to be woven into understanding. Later, as she settled into her armchair with a cup of tea, Miss Marple allowed her mind to revisit the events at Dalloway Hall one last time. Colonel Hardwicke's misguided attempt at control, Rupert Vale's ill-considered intrusion into the past, and Mrs. Hardwicke's quiet dignity had all combined into a tapestry of human complexity. And through it all, the lesson had been clear: observance and patience, coupled with an understanding of character, could illuminate truths hidden from the eye of those too hurried, too confident, or too self-involved to notice. As evening fell, the village outside her window softened under the first hints of a late winter frost, the faint glimmer of ice catching the lamplight like tiny stars. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the familiar click of needles blending with the gentle hush of the night. She thought of the villagers, each absorbed in their own small dramas, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The game at Dalloway Hall had ended, but its lessons endured, reminders of vigilance, of empathy, and of the subtle ways in which human nature revealed itself when tested. And as she watched the last light fade behind the cottages, Miss Marple knew that, while the festive game of fatal lies was concluded, life itself remained a series of small mysteries, each waiting for a patient eye, a gentle mind, and a steady hand to discern its hidden truths. In the quiet of her sitting room, With the fire casting dancing shadows across the walls, she felt the enduring certainty that understanding, though often elusive, was always within reach for those willing to observe, to reflect, and to see the hearts behind the facades. Winter had loosened its grip on little Dalloway, and the first hints of spring began to touch the village with soft green shoots and the faint scent of thawing earth. Life, as it always did, returned to its measured rhythms. The villagers moved through their days with polite conversation and gentle routines, though whispers of the past weeks lingered like shadows at the edges of memory. Colonel Hardwick had been taken into custody, facing the legal consequences of his recklessness. The public tragedy had been softened by the understanding that no deliberate malice had been intended, and yet the lessons were inescapable. Secrets, when wielded carelessly, could become weapons more dangerous than any knife or poison. Rupert Vale had returned to London, chastened and wary, carrying the bitter knowledge that action, Bess, driven by obsession, rarely yielded the satisfaction imagined. Clara Whitcomb resumed her teaching with renewed confidence, her experiences lending a quiet maturity to her gentle demeanor, while Mrs. Bantry continued to serve as the moral compass and compassionate confidant of the community, quietly restoring the social equilibrium disturbed by the game. Miss Marple herself had returned to St. Mary Mead, the familiar streets and cottages welcoming her with quiet familiarity. She spent her days attending to small village affairs, observing human nature with the same patient attention she always had. And yet she carried with her the faint imprint of Dalloway Hall, the game, the letters, the subtle shifts of behavior that had revealed the truth hidden behind propriety and pretense. It had been a case not of detection through force, but of insight, the quiet skill of noticing what others dismissed, of reading the unspoken language of the heart. As she sat by her fire, the knitting needles clicking gently in her lap, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance of human life. The world contained mischief and malice, yes, but also kindness and courage, often hidden in the smallest gestures. The festive game of fatal lies had revealed both the darkness and the resilience inherent in people, and it had reaffirmed her conviction that careful observation and gentle understanding were the surest tools in uncovering the truths that shaped lives. Outside, the village lay calm, touched with the pale light of an early spring afternoon. Children played on the green, neighbors exchanged greetings, and the simple, ordinary flow of life went on, carrying the quiet knowledge that, beneath the surface of civility, the human heart remained as intricate and unpredictable as ever. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside, a small, serene smile on her lips. The game was over, the mystery solved, and yet the world remained a place of endless fascination. Secrets would continue to exist, hearts would continue to hide their truths, and lives would continue to intertwine in patterns, both gentle and dangerous. And Miss Marple, as ever, would be ready, watching, listening, understanding, waiting patiently for the next small sign, the next subtle hesitation, the next whispered clue that might reveal the hidden currents of human nature. In her quiet, unassuming way, she ensured that even the most intricate of mysteries would, one day, be seen clearly and understood fully. The fire crackled softly as she returned to her knitting, and the village, tranquil in its ordinary rhythms, settled into a peaceful evening, its secrets safely observed for now by the gentle, unerring eyes of Miss Jane Marple. The story of the festive game of fatal lies had ended, but life, with all its subtle intrigues and hidden truths, would continue, and Miss Marple would remain quietly at its vigilant heart.